This assignment is going to talk about layered space and how to make a kind of atmospheric effect with mark making. But in order to do that, we first have to talk about something called crosshatching. Some of you may be familiar with this from other drawing classes or looking at drawings on your own. But it's a matter of taking lots of parallel lines and layering them. Instead of pressing down with graphite or charcoal and making things darker and darker and darker, it's a matter of taking lines, gestures, that then layer themselves more densely and more densely, so that you end up with darker values as you simply make more layers of this this crosshatching. So I've very vaguely and barely visibly mapped out a little grid here of 5 rectangles on this sheet of paper. And I'd like you to try this particular kind of exercise, not as a kind of final assignment or any kind of fine drawing, but just to get into a kind of aerobics of moving your hand and perceiving things as they get more layered and darker. I'm asking you to do several zones of these things that get progressively denser and darker. So this whole strip will have one, and it's almost arbitrary in terms of the way you do it, but one particular layer of lines, and then another and another and another through 5 zones. I'm going to arbitrarily start this with a bunch of horizontal lines that go across the area that I'm drawing. Now this is simply a grid, a zone that will be the first layer of value. You don't have to be as absolutely straight as I am, but you basically have to do longish horizontal lines, casually equally distanced, okay, as best you can. And if you do that, you have your first layer of value that then will be built with more marks on top of it. I've got my little cheating pencil grid here that it allows me to start at a vertical angle, and that's kind of important whether you have a cheat pencil grid to begin with or not. If you can start each layer with this particular exercise, each layer of the cross-hatching zones with a straight line, in other words, go up against the straight line instead of some sort of meandering thing, you end up with things that are much more evenly progressive, as if you were doing a kind of design value chart that goes from light to near black. I'm going to again go in another different direction here. And just as an aside, not anything you have to worry about when you're starting out, but if your lines are at an angle, if they intersect at an angle, there tends to be more of a kind of visual energy. There tends to be more of a kind of optical excitement along those areas, as opposed to things that are more placidly right-angled and horizontal and vertical. So I've got another one here to do. So I'm going to try a slightly different angle that goes back. And with these, you're going to again casually try to do lines that are casually evenly distanced. In other words, don't bunch them up to make things dark. Allow the very layering, the very piling up of lines upon lines to make the darkness. And I guess I have one more to go here, and I'll just do another one in this way. I'll go up against that edge. When you get going here, it's sometimes hard to find the exact angle that makes sense, but as you get denser and denser, it really doesn't matter. So there you have it, a kind of evenly developed value chart that relies on cross-hatching. So this next assignment is concerning something called layered space, and it's more traditional kind of drawing than negative space, in that you'll be doing things that are real and have highlight and shadow on them. But you're also becoming very concerned about making marks that become atmospheric, making a drawing of space itself in some ways, not in a kind of light and bright way that we have it here, but in a way that where the marks become a means by which you make things move back in a kind of atmospheric density. So what you will do, I'll explain how to do this step by step, but at the same time, up front I want you to know that you will be doing two of the large drawings, which I'll demonstrate today, and that there's at the end of this there's a sequential stop action that actually shows you the steps, so you can go back and forth and see exactly the steps you need to make this happen. But I do at least one of a practice page of 3 or more of these sorts of drawings, and I also want you to do 2 of these particular drawings that are about this size. Come in from your 14 by 17 or your 12 by 18 papers, depending on what papers you got from the studio. So 2 relatively large ones, but brought in from the sides to be more manageable. And refer to the end sequence of layering that makes more sense in terms of how this is done. So although you haven't seen a final piece yet, you are going to be concerned with drawing a setup. I would say 3 objects, okay? 3 objects, and I would make those objects, I would find those objects and use those objects as fairly simple ones, okay? I think lemons are really ideal for this because they are light in value, they respond to highlights and shadows very nicely, they're relatively simple in shape, and they're not terribly expensive. If you don't have them or you can't get hold of them, some of the other things that might happen would still be a kind of simple produce repetition. In other words, you need objects that are the same family, okay, the same thing repeated 3 times. Yellow apples, green apples, something that's fairly organic looking and simple and easy to set up. So we're setting these guys up on a surface, and I would remain relatively high, looking down on them, close and high looking down on them. In fact, I'd even play a game whereby, as I've done this quick pencil sketch here, which you may or may not see, where I've separated them so that there is space in between, horizontal space in between each of the objects. That becomes important when you are doing these marks that become the space itself, the atmosphere itself. And just as you've seen a kind of demonstration of cross-hatching, so you're going to do with this large paper your Sharpie. You should have a Sharpie in your kit, a small, thin, well, a relatively thin Sharpie, not the big ones. And then for your test strips, for your drawings that are going to be the practice drawings, you also have a fairly thinner pen in your kit. So small pen, thin pen for the practice ones, and Sharpie for the relatively large one that's going to be in from the sides of your moderate size paper. Okay, so just as any kind of straightforward drawing, you're going to do lights and darks, and as you've seen in a demonstration, I'm going to first begin to deal with these things with the cross-hatching that we've talked about. This is a little bit self-conscious and mechanical right now. It'll get more energetic as we go on. But as you see these things in shadow and highlight, I'd like you to, with layering of cross-hatching, don't get too dark too quick, layering of cross-hatching, give them a highlight and shadow that gives them some sort of form, okay? And because you've got a kind of template of scrubbed and rubbed and proper proportion pencil marks here, it should be relatively easy to put those things in. You're welcome to, with the pencil, give yourself a little bit of indication where the shadows are going to go, so you're not doing it totally by accident or guesswork in the beginning. And the thing about the cross-hatching that comes to mind as I do this, and as I do all these straight lines, is that they don't necessarily have to be all straight. In other words, if you've got a form that has a kind of curvilinear aspect to it, like these lemons, okay, you don't have to stay to one direction as you're doing the cross-hatching for the lemons themselves or the subjects themselves. You can actually turn, you can actually do curved lines that still become a kind of layering of value, but they become much more like latitude and longitude lines, you know, in a map or a globe, whereby they're wrapping the form. Here, when it comes to the cast shadows, I'm a little too close to my drawing here, but here with the cast shadows, you are you're doing, I think, most successfully straight lines that sort of express the flatness, the tabletop straightness and planar quality that's there. These are a little too simple right now. I might make them a little bit more detailed depending on the kind of value that I see in front of me. Just layering and layering, trying to keep them somewhat the same weight, not too different in terms of their width or their darkness. With a pen, a Sharpie, it should be fairly mechanically straightforward, that they are the same as you use them across the paper. I do a little off parallel in this one to give some dynamic to the cross-hatching. So if you want to go back and make things darker, okay, or emphasize an edge, dots and dashes along with the cross-hatching can work relatively well. Okay, if you find that there's not enough definition on one side, or you need to make a more obvious and defined edge, both on the shadow and on the lemon itself, you're welcome to do that. Okay, I'm going to make this a little bit darker by bringing things out from the edge like that. And just as in any of your drawings, when you define something on the outside of the object, okay, you're really defining the actual contour of the object. It's not just an outline. In fact, the outlines are something that you should really avoid in these kinds of drawings. If you need to have a darker designation of the edge or the contour of these things, again, a bunch of dots or dashes, something very casual that doesn't give you a hard and fast outline, because we're going to use these contours as very important borders for the space, the kind of markings of atmosphere that are going to happen to make these look like they're going back in space in a much more defined way. Okay, let me just bring this out a little bit more. I'm simply following my pencil contour and getting what seems to be the shapes that are here. So at a distance, not too bad, okay? I might make this a little bit more dark on this side. I might make this a little bit more dark on this side, okay, and come into this bump on the lemon in a more dark way. This looks pretty good for what it is, okay? So you don't have to go crazy about rendering the things, but you do need to give them, if I can move this, a presence whereby They're in highlight and shadow, and they've got obvious cast shadows across the table. Now here's where it gets strange. Here's where it gets a little bit funny. Some more dots in this. Here's where it gets very different than the kinds of drawings. This is sort of a sane drawing, right? This is sort of a thing that you might do with any kind of still life, whether it's charcoal or graphite or any kind of dark or black value material. But I'm going to really emphasize in this drawing that you're doing the space, the atmosphere, the distance in this particular setup. So I've spaced them so that there's a little bit of horizontal distance between them, okay? I put them just for the sake of variety in different twists and turns, okay? And here's where it becomes a little bit different. Think about space as a thing to draw. Think about space as a kind of rainfall. Think about space as a kind of atmosphere of dust or some sort of material that is translucent. So if there is space between me and the lemons that I've set up, I'm going to give myself, and this is where it becomes a little bit difficult on a larger scale. You can make this a little bit smaller if you want, the drawing itself. But try to, as I'm trying very hard myself, try to make it so that the rainfall of lines, okay, the screen, this sort of net of activity goes across the page and covers everything. What I've discovered, belatedly, is that even with these particular angles of lines, if you break them up a little bit, it becomes a little bit more physically doable for you to do a continuous set of lines in a given direction, okay? And that, it's really counterintuitive and sort of weird to do because it feels like you're destroying what you've just drawn, okay? So I'm asking you to trust me that the final product might look a little bit more realistic, if kind of rude and expressive. It should be fairly realistic in terms of both the objects and the space that you're doing if you keep this relatively even and consistent, as I'm trying to do, across this vast space. And again, I'm doing a large scale here to make it more obvious for the demo, but you might bring this in a little bit, not as small as your practice piece, but bring it in maybe a couple of inches on a side so that you've got less of a kind of tedious continuity to do. As I'm almost successful in doing, you want these relatively the same width. I might put one more in here just to keep it more consistent. So there's that kind of rainfall, that kind of arbitrary angle that you've done on top of the subjects. Now, the only thing we have here to show space is the objects themselves. You've got these three markers, these three solid things that exist in space, and I'm going to use those. I'm going to use those as the excuse to draw more space, all right? Just as your negative space had a kind of blackness around a silhouette, what I'm doing here in these next three layers is taking the shape of the lemon, the shape of your subject, apple, pear, anonymous, repetitive subject that you have, and finding another angle at which to take the lines. And I'm starting against that contour. That's why the dots and dashes and pencil lines are pretty useful for you. And I'm doing a set of lines that don't go down below the object itself. I've got this one space that I've just done a rainfall of, okay? I've got this next space that goes to the side, no lower than the first object, but to the sides of the first object. And it's good if you don't make too strong a geometric line along here. Keep them sort of bumpy and vague in their ending, so that it becomes a little bit more blended and atmospheric from one layer to the other. And I'm sort of avoiding going through it, okay? I'm not going through that lemon. I'm going above it and alongside it. Above it and alongside it. So that I'm doing another sort of desecration, sort of covering of the object that you've drawn. But nonetheless, it becomes ever increasingly dense and sort of dramatic and atmospheric as you go back in space. I'm going all the way up to the top. All the way up to the top. All the way up to the top. And I'm going from lemon to lemon, changing my direction, changing my angle as best as possible. There are no rules for this, but you don't want to get them too parallel to one another, as I sometimes do myself. You don't want to get them sort of going in close to the same direction, because you lose that sort of cross-hatching energy. You lose that sort of angular openness that happens when they intersect. So I've done the first layer, a second layer around this lemon and back like that. I need another one. I need another one. And I'm going to try to find an angle that's somewhat different than the ones I've got so far. And I think I'd be safest with one that might just go like this. And again, up against the contour of the lemon, not going through it, up against the shadow of the lemon, over the cast shadow, through the cast shadow where the space is alongside the lemon itself. So, as in any of your drawings, you define what's there as 3D and real because you have drawn up to and around it with some other kind of value, some other kind of space. In your graphite drawings, you did that background space, many of you, where the white object was more defined and more obvious and more there because its edge was up against a darkness and back. So although outlines and contours are wonderful to get the shape, with this particular kind of drawing you don't want to push any outline that's dark, because it is the space itself that is defining the object. So I've done 1, this, 2, this, 3, this. And what am I going to do for a final direction in this one here that's not going to contradict or come too close to what I have? Let's try something like this. In fact, the more you have a kind of diagonal or close to diagonal intersection of these things, the more sparkly, the more dynamic, the more sort of atmospheric and energetic these things become. And it really becomes obvious when I'll get some space on this before space meaning I'll get some distance on this. I went a little too far down that way, but nonetheless, keep on going. If you lose your objects, if you find that you've sort of done so much dense space that you lose the definition of your objects, you're welcome to go back. And especially with shadows that are cast, and certainly as well with shadows that might be on the object itself, you can bring back their particular definition by making it more obvious. So not quite perfect, but nonetheless, if we put some distance on that, okay, you get a sense that these things are going back in space and that they're being sort of obscured by a kind of atmospheric energy.